Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Trump Watch. The show that y'all know keeps a watch on President Trump, especially in the context of the measures that he and his administration are taking that destroy our freedom and our well-being. One of the fascinating aspects of the end of the Cold War in 1989 to 1991 was the response of the national security establishment. Of course, the national security state was not always America's governmental system. America started out as what we call a limited government republic. And that was because our American ancestors, hated standing armies, big military intelligence establishments. And they wanted to make it clear that this was never going to be part of America's governmental system. And so we had what was called a limited government republic, which with a basic, relatively small military force. And that lasted for over 100 years. It was a remarkable system, and it was remarkable that it lasted so long. But in the 20th century, Americans decided to move in a different direction, in the opposite direction. And that was the direction of a huge standing army, which our ancestors had opposed. And it was called a national security state, which is a form of totalitarian governmental structure, in the sense that it wields omnipotent powers. It's omnipotent government. But it was all couched in terms of just continuing the limited government republic, because they wanted Americans to feel like nothing had significantly changed. But it was a revolutionary change, and it was done without a constitutional amendment. Total change in America's governmental structure, where the government now wielded omnipotent power, such as the power of assassination. That is, the power to just snuff out a person's life without any notice, without due process of law, just kill them. And that was, of course, the power that was exercised by the Soviet Union, the North Korea, other totalitarian states. And in fact, that was the rationale behind this conversion, which took place in around 1947 in the late 40s, that the communists were coming to get us. They were hell-bent on coming to get us and conquer our country and teach communism in the public, i.e. government school systems. And so to protect ourselves, we needed to be like them. That was the argument. And our government needed to wield the same kind of powers that they were wielding, like the power of assassination, the power of torture, indefinite detention. And to inculcate this mindset, to accept this radical change, the U.S. officials inculcated fear into the American people. And fear is the coin of the realm in any national security state. So this was the fear of communists. The communists are coming to get us. And the idea was, okay, the World War II has ended successfully. We defeated the Nazi armies and the Nazi regime, but unfortunately, we cannot rest. We now are facing a brand new enemy that is arguably more dangerous than the Nazis, and that's the Communist Army. And there was the Soviet Union, and there was Red China, and North Korea, and North Vietnam, and then communist outposts in Cuba and Guatemala, and then Chile, and then here in the United States, there were communists everywhere. They were convinced that Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement were communists. There was the Communist Party. There was the people out in Hollywood that had been members of the Communist Party who believed in communism. And I mean, it was just, when we were growing up, we were exhorted to look under our beds for communists because the Reds were everywhere. And so this was the rationale. Keep everybody scared. And so that, of course, meant that the national security state could continue indefinitely because the Cold War was going to go on forever. At least that's what everybody was convinced. And so we might as well just get used to it, that this opposite system from a limited government republic and really from a free society, because you can't really be free when you live under a totalitarian, omnipotent government, that it was going to be here forever, but it was okay because it was going to be keeping us safe from the communist takeover of the United States and teaching children communism in the public schools and so forth. And then suddenly in 1989, 1990, 1991, it was over. I mean, it surprised everybody, especially people in the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, the principal parts of the national security establishment. And so they were freaking out because people started calling for what was called a peace dividend. And that meant a significant reduction in spending for the national security establishment. Now, people were not yet calling for a dismantling of the whole apparatus and a restoration of our founding system of a limited government republic, which had lasted for over 100 and some odd years. But they were calling for significant reductions. And so the national security establishment was freaking out because they got caught flat-footed, because it was really the Soviet Union that said, okay, it's over. We're done. And we're ready to establish peaceful and harmonious relationships. And they tore down the Berlin Wall, and they sent their troops back to Russia, liberated Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and so forth. It was a remarkable period and really a great opportunity for the United States to establish harmonious relationship with the nations that had been the rationale for this giant Cold War. And so I'll never forget how the Pentagon started saying, look, we're still necessary because we can help fight the war on drugs. Okay, because the war on drugs was a big measure, principal program, as it is today, back in the 1980s and 90s, and even before that, the 70s, the 60s. I mean, I grew up there on the border, the U.S.-Mexico border, and the drug war has been there since I was a kid. I mean, I had friends in high school that were convicted of federal offenses for crossing the river and bringing back marijuana or selling marijuana or whatever. So this war has been going on forever. So the military says, wait, don't do it. Don't do the peace dividend. Don't reduce our spending. We can participate in this. Well, they didn't have to do that because the Persian Gulf War started with their old partner and ally Saddam Hussein, and then there was a whole 10 or 11 years where Saddam is coming to get us, and I mean, that got tedious, but that was the whole new official enemy, that Saddam and his weapons of mass destruction, mushroom clouds over American cities, and it is like day after day after day. I remember we had a donor here at FFF that finally called in exasperation and said, we just need to invade and get rid of this guy. And I said, why? Well, because it was like he was going crazy because of, Saddam Hussein. He was so tired of hearing about it. And so finally they invaded the 9/11 attacks, which were a direct result. If you don't buy the inside story, that this was an inside the government terrorist attack, a false flag operation, sort of like Operation Northwoods that the government had planned, and you believe that it's foreign policy. Well, it was just blowback for what they were doing in the Middle East, their unconditional support of Israel and the embargo, the sanctions against the Iraqi people, which were killing multitudes of Iraqi children. People were getting angry, and you had a foretaste of that in a 1993 attack on the World Trade Center, where the attacker said, yes, because what you're doing in the Middle East, your government. And so then that comes about, and so now they were off to the races. They had their war on terrorism, which they said justified snuffing out people's lives, attacking whatever country they wanted to. It was just carte blanche for total omnipotent government. And then, of course, here domestically, too, the Patriot Act, which eviscerated the Fourth Amendment, right to privacy, the TSA groping of people's bodies at the airport. I mean, it was just the war on terrorism was as good a racket as the Cold War, if not better. But they never gave up on Russia and China. Russia and China were trying to establish good relations, but boy, Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA would have nothing to do with that. It had been a cash cow. So they used NATO to keep moving eastward, although they had U.S. officials had promised that wouldn't happen. But the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA overruled the diplomats, the State Department, and said, no, we're going to do this. And the idea was to provoke a new conflict with Russia, and that's what, of course, Ukraine is all about. They kept absorbing Eastern European countries within this old Cold War dinosaur called NATO, which should have just dismantled. But that would not have been able to keep the racket going. And then at the same time, they invade Afghanistan, they invade Iraq. 20 years of war in Afghanistan, and America really hasn't come to terms with it. because as soon as they got kicked out of Afghanistan after a massive loss of life on the part of the Afghan people and U.S. troops, they immediately provoked this war with Russia and Ukraine with NATO. So there's no time to reflect on what had happened. I mean, this is a momentous thing, this 20-year war. Not to mention the attack on Iraq, which had never attacked the United States, killing multitudes of people, innocent people. People had done nothing against the United States. America has never engaged in that soul searching, that reflection, and the national security establishment didn't want that national reflection, and so they provoked this war with Ukraine, and so they're Trump's all upset that Russia is not accepting a ceasefire and so forth. Well, what Trump doesn't understand, or maybe he does, but what the national security establishment clearly understands is that the real key to this is dismantling NATO. I mean, it's a no-brainer, and Putin keeps making reference to that indirectly. He doesn't say it directly because I think he doesn't want to get Trump to lose his temper. He's trying to stay on his good side as much as he can because remember, Trump was once good friends with Putin. In fact, Trump got impeached because everybody thought he was a secret agent of the Russians. Remember, that was what the Robert Mueller report was. Oh, Robert Mueller's going to save us. He's going to save us. And then, of course, after a year or so, Robert Mueller comes back and says, well, no, there's no evidence he's an agent. But now Trump, after, dressing down and berating Ukraine and the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, and castigating him for not wearing a suit to the White House and so forth, and saying he's the one that started the war, has now said, no, we're gonna continue supporting Ukraine. We're going to send weapons. And now they're talking about sending weapons and authorizing Zelensky to fire long-range missiles. So what's not clear is that who is calling the shots here. Is it Trump calling the shots, or is it the national security establishment? And in my opinion, it's the national security establishment. They have been in charge of the federal government for ever since really they got established. The Supreme Court won't touch them. And especially after the Kennedy assassination, when they got away with that, nobody in Congress, the Supreme Court, the president, nobody's going to touch him. And as y'all know, I've long advocated a book called National Security and Double Government by Michael Glennon. And it's just a remarkable book. And its thesis is that the national security state is in charge of the federal government. So my hunch is it's the national security establishment that's making the policies here in Ukraine, and Trump's just following orders. That's my opinion. And because it's just too strange for Trump to change from a pro-Putin attitude to a pro-Zelensky attitude. And the national security establishment never gave up on restoring Russia as an official enemy. It was too much of a cash cow for them. And they've succeeded in doing that. And at the same time, when they were bogged down in Afghanistan, they could see China was prospering because they weren't bogged down in any foreign imperialist war. They still had a semi-socialist system, but they were making friends all over the world, and empires hate that. And so they needed a way to bring China down, and all of a sudden you've got a big trade war against China that is bankrupting American farmers again. I mean, you remember, this started out in the first Trump administration, this trade war against China, and he bankrupted farmers there, but put them on welfare, gave them a welfare program. And now Trump's saying, well, he's going to do the same thing again. Welfare for the farmers that are being bankrupted, soybean farmers. I mean, people don't want welfare. These farmers don't want welfare. Now, given a choice between losing all their money, I'm sure they're going to take the welfare, but that's not what they want. They want to be productive enterprises selling to people around the world, which they were doing until Trump's tariffs came along. And so here we still have the tariffs. Trump is saying that he's going to put, 10% tariffs on lumber as well as 25% on upholstered wooden furniture, bathroom vanities, and kitchen cabinets. So the Wall Street Journal talked about the killer IKEA sofas that Trump is protecting us from, and all these other goods. I mean, we can see the massive destruction that has taken place with this really omnipotent presidential power. I mean, did you ever think you'd see the day when you'd live in a society where the ruler can just raise taxes whenever he wants? And that's what a tariff is. It's just a sales tax. And it's just phenomenal. I'm going to raise taxes 25% over there, 10% over there. That's what dictatorial power is all about, where you don't have to go to Congress. And you don't need to worry about the courts. Now, the courts have declared this unconstitutional. It's going to be interesting. You got a district court that declared it unconstitutional. You got a court of appeals that upheld that decision. Not clear where the Supreme Court's going to come out. But my hunch is that the court's going to defer to Trump. And because I think they're going to sense that the national security state, the establishment, Pentagon, CIA, and the NSA are also behind these tariffs and this trade war. And they're not going to touch the national security state. They have long made that clear, that no matter what the Fifth Amendment says about due process of law and no taking of life and liberty and property without due process of law, that doesn't apply to the national security establishment. Nobody's going to touch them. So, but I mean, you live under this dictatorial system that's proving so damaging to the American people, not to mention our liberty. I mean, it's a basic fundamental fact of economic liberty that you have a right to trade with whomever you want. It's your money. You want to buy from a Cuban, you want to travel to Cuba, you want to spend money in Cuba, that's your right as an individual, as a free individual. Now, clearly that right's been destroyed by the federal government and the national security state. You go to Cuba today and you spend money there, they will put you in jail when you get back. They will prosecute you. They will convict you. They will sentence you, and they will incarcerate and fine you. I mean, and it's just the power they're exercising is no different from the power exercised by the Cuban regime that they're saying they're protecting us from because it's a communist socialist regime. Well, they're exercising the same socialist power over how people spend their money. And it's the same with China or Russia or any of these other countries where there's sanctions and embargoes, and it's a destruction not just of those people, but of our own liberty. This is what Americans don't realize, is that they cheer Trump. Oh, he's making America great again. No, he's not. He's destroying our freedom. You can't have a great country when you live under a dictatorial type power like that, one that is taxing us out the gazoo. It's a contradiction. Freedom entails a right to keep everything you earn, decide what you want to do with it, whether you want to donate, share it, spend it, invest it, buy, sell, with whomever you want in the world. Now, I'm not suggesting that's the only destruction of freedom that's going on. Of course, we have the welfare state, the income tax, the IRS, the paper money system, the war on immigrants, the public school, government school system. I mean, I could go on and on. But when you add all these systems up, and I'm like I've said before, it's not Trump that's the problem. It's these systems that Americans believe in, including, unfortunately, many libertarians. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. A lot of libertarians have thrown in the towel and said, we got to keep these in at least for the next 50 years. Let's reform them. Let's fix them. Let's make them better. It's the same with the public school system. They say public schooling is here to stay. And this is where the indoctrination begins, where people are inculcated with these fears of official enemies and so forth, and are willing to adopt anything to be kept safe from whoever the government designates as the official enemy. And we can see this there in the Caribbean, where Trump and the military are now killing people. I mean, just killing people, blowing them out of the water, just on an allegation that they're drug dealers. This is phenomenal. I mean, drug dealing is a criminal offense. It shouldn't be an offense, but it is. But it's a criminal offense, just like terrorism. And Trump's very cleverly, and the Pentagon are very cleverly saying, well, they're more than drug dealers, they're also terrorists. Because they know that when the Supreme Court hears the word terrorism, or some federal judge hears terrorism, they all freak out. Oh my gosh, the terrorists are coming to get us. You know, like the Reds were coming to get us. And they're going to sustain anything because that involves the national security establishment, the military. The military goes after the terrorists. Well, But terrorism is a federal criminal offense too. Just look it up in the U.S. Code. Go into any of the federal courts in Virginia, New York, or whatever. You see terrorist prosecutions because it's a federal criminal offense. But they've got the military involved, and so that's supposed to make it sacrosanct. So they're just killing people. And that power can be exercised here domestically. It's just setting a precedent. It's normalizing the killing of people in the name of the war on drugs. And so it's ironic, I started out this program by talking about how the military said, oh, no peace dividend at the end of the Cold War. We'll do the drug war. And here they are doing the drug war. They're off the coast of Venezuela. It's fascinating because they don't have an active war going on. Like what happened after the end of the Cold War. They had lost their official enemy. Now they've got Ukraine, which is clearly a U.S. war. This is a Pentagon, CIA, NSA war against Russia. They want to degrade Russia. They want to make Russia into another, or the same big official enemy to justify their ever-increasing budgets and control and so forth. But it is fascinating how the world has come around to them. I mean, they're now waging the drug war, and I'm surprised they haven't brought up the communist threat with respect to Venezuela. But instead, it's the drug war. But there's also the war on immigrants going on. But let me say one more thing about this drug war. It's all designed to prevent Americans from ingesting drugs. I mean, they say, well, they're attacking. The drug dealers are attacking. It's like they're coming to America from Venezuela 1,000 miles away or so, and they're grabbing Americans and forcing cocaine in their noses. No, it's nothing like that. You've got a nation of people that want drugs for whatever reason. And these are the adults that attended the DARE classes in public schooling 50 years ago, or 40 years ago, or 30 years ago. And these are people that want to ingest mind-altering substances, which I think is part of living in this dysfunctional society, along with the suicides and the off-kilter killings that we see regularly now in American society. This is what happens when you live in a society where everybody thinks they're free, when the screws are being tightened ever more so by the government. You're free, you're free. Why are these screws getting so tight on me? Oh, that's what freedom's all about. And so it creates dysfunctionality, alcoholism, and so forth. Look at the Soviet Union, how many people were alcoholics there. And it's the same here. But I think at least in the Soviet Union, people knew they weren't free. Here, people are convinced they're free, which makes their malady much worse. But if Americans would just stand up and say, we don't want the government to protect us anymore. You see that Trump acts like he's doing a favor to the American drug users. That I'm doing you a favor by preventing access to the drugs. But really, there's no way he can do that. Look, if they can't, they're mad because they're saying Venezuela is not stopping these drugs. Like Mexico, the Mexican government's not stopping the drugs out of Mexico. The Colombian government's not stopping drugs. The American government hasn't done anything to stop the distribution of drugs in the United States. Okay? Oh, they've tried. Mandatory minimum sentences, acid forfeiture, but the black market's too powerful. And so there's really one way to get rid of all this violence, and that's legalize drugs. Just like we legalized prohibition, the criminality of alcohol possession and distribution. That put an end to all the violence. But they don't want that. The national security state doesn't want to get rid of that violence because that's the justification for this murderous campaign in the Caribbean and foreign interventionism in Venezuela. And there still could be a war there. If Trump and his military drug war goons start bombing drug facilities there. But they know that they're never going to get rid of the black market. But the black market serves as their excuse for doing all this. And then when you combine that with the war on terrorism, which is just as big a racket as the Cold War, with the whole war on immigrants. I mean, did you ever think you'd live in a country where the military would be occupying American cities? I mean, this is like welcome to Pinochet land. This is how life was like under General Pinochet. Now, Trump's not a general, and Pinochet was a general, but the principle's the same when you start normalizing troops in American cities. and then you're attacking habeas corpus and due process of law, and civil liberties, all you're doing is just normalizing the situation in order to set the stage for martial law or military control, like there was in Pinochet land. And this is just a variation, a normalization of a very brutal and tyrannical system, setting the stage for it down the line. And therefore, it's a positive sign that there's a lot of resistance to it, including among some courageous federal judges that see what's going on here. But as I've said in my new book, The Case for Open Borders, a primer, which I highly recommend getting. It's $1 on Amazon. This is just another form of tyranny, an excuse for tyranny. Troops in American cities, masked agents grabbing people off the streets, carting them away and disappearing them, or sending them into third world countries for torture and definite detention and destruction of freedom of association, freedom of economic liberty, freedom of contract. At least I think people, including many libertarians who have supported this socialist system of immigration controls, and that's what it is, it's based on socialist central planning and a police state. I think at least everybody's seeing that you can't have a free society and this system as well. Just like you can't have a free society and drug laws, you can't, and a welfare state, and a paper money system, and a central bank, and public schooling. You cannot have a free society with this socialist system of immigration controls and the police state that comes with it, and the militarization of American society, and concertina wire, and troops occupying American cities. And it's just getting worse and worse and worse. But there's a way out. You legalize drugs. See, if American drug users or American people just said, thank you, Mr. Trump, but we don't want your protection anymore. We don't need it. If we want to take drugs, we want to take drugs, and that's all. If we want to do dangerous things in life, you just leave us alone. If the American people were to force Congress to end this evil and immoral war on drugs, you'd be pulling the rug out for these people. Because what would they be doing in the Caribbean? How could they be justifying killing people without the drug war? Okay, and then the same with the open borders. That's why I wanted to come out with this book, like a primer. You can read the book in an hour and a half. It just gave him the basic arguments. I've said this for 35 years at FFF. There's only one solution to this mayhem, this perpetual crisis, death, suffering, police state. And that's this concept of open borders, genuine open borders. And so that's why I wrote this book. I want a primer. I wanted an easy to read tract for people to say, huh. And this is not the only book on open borders. I would recommend everybody buying the other books. You can go on Amazon, put The Case for Open Borders, and I think about 4 books pop up, maybe 5, including our book. But remember, we also published a book back in the 90s, FFF did, called The Case for Free Trade and Open Immigration. So I'd recommend getting FFF's books, that book, and my book, The Case for Open Borders, a primer. Then there's one by John Washington, The Case for Open Borders. He's a liberal or progressive, but it makes fantastic arguments in favor of why this system is the only practical system. It works. It's moral. It's consistent with religious principles, moral principles, free market principles. There's also a great book, I think it's about 20 years old, by Jason Riley, who I think serves on the board at the Wall Street Journal Board of Trustees, some capacity there, called Let Them In, The Case for Open Borders. And then there's a relatively new book called The Case for Open Borders that I've gone partway through. That's a fascinating read that hits things that are totally different from the other books. Anybody that reads this little collection of 4 or 5 books, I think inevitably they will see, my gosh, this really is the solution. And then it pulls the carpet out from all these people in the government, Trump and the military and so forth, that are using the war on immigrants as an excuse to destroy our freedom here with militarization of American society. And it's only getting worse. He wants to send troops everywhere. I'm convinced of it. And that normalizes, it gets ready so that if there is a big crisis, it's much easier. People are accustomed to it. It's like boiling the frog syndrome. You don't throw a frog into a vat of boiling water because he might hop out. You put the frog into the boiling water, regular water, and then you start turning up the temperature. And I have no doubt that's what's going on now. And so I think that pretty much wraps up. This week marks the beginning of our Libertarian Angle conversion for a period of time, 6 weeks or so, to the critical importance of civil liberties. And so you'd be looking for that on Thursdays. We're going to have a guest presenter, and then Richard, Ebeline, and I are going to be interacting with them. Civil liberties are key to a free society, habeas corpus, due process. And so we said it's time to revisit this theme because civil liberty is under assault. You cannot live in a free society without economic liberty. We all know that as libertarians. But you also cannot live in a free society that doesn't have civil liberties. And so that's why we wanted to have this series beginning this week, this coming Thursday. Look for it. Our first presenter will be Jim Bovard, who I know y'all are familiar, has been with FFF for decades now, not just years. So that's Trump Watch for this week. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for your great support of FFF. We couldn't do it without those of you that help us out financially. And for that, we're very, very appreciative. And I look forward to talking to you next week.